start now, B'Sha'ah Tova, our second class of the second cycle of Semicha, but now with the full body of students. The classes of the first cycle are all posted on Spreaker. You can listen to them. And before we continue with the theme of Avelut, I wanted to address a question that someone emailed me today, and that was the question was what is really expected in the process of issuing a psak halacha, because the focus of this program, there are many different semicha programs. Some rabbinical school focus on giving the students, the tools and means to work with the synagogue, which is beautiful and important, and maybe we'll talk about it in the future. And others focus on learning the halachot of isur ve'eter, of kashrut, meat and dairy, etc., Shabbat, Nida, which we're also going to do. But the focus of this program is on Pesach, meaning that hopefully, as we go through it, we'll be able to emerge with an ability to write and issue a psak halacha that we feel confident with, that we feel confident either if we issue it for ourselves or for others. So the question is, what is the process? What is the logical process for issuing such a psak halacha? So I'm describing it very briefly, and in the future we're going to enter it with more in depth, but just the general outline. So the first classes that we did on the Semicha program that are on Spreaker covered the issue of the Bible and halacha, meaning that we looked at the Tanakh from beginning to end, searching for instances where the Torah tells us how people practiced halacha. Not when the Torah tells us what to do, but rather a real description what people did. So this is the first step. We go back. The very first step that we do when we look at the sources is to go, and I say the first step is because this we have to know even before we are asked a question. Ideally, a Talmid Chacham or Talmidat Chachamim should know the totality of Tanakh. They should be very comfortable with when they're being asked a question to say, okay, there's something in the Torah or in the Tanakh that could be associated with that. Because from all of our literature, the only part of our literature that we could say unequivocally, which is divine, is the Tanakh. The rest of our literature, yes, people said it was written with divine inspiration, Ruach HaKodesh, etc., etc. But we know it was written by men, very intelligent men, very inspired men, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud and all, but they were not prophets. It was not the divine word. They worked with the text that was provided to them. The only text which is divine is the Tanakh, so we must be able to start there. So this is before even we're asked the question. But when we're asked the question, we have to ask ourselves several things. One, what is at stake? What is at stake in terms of how is it going to impact the person who's asking the question and his environment, his surroundings? There's a concept that is very became a favorite concept among authors of halacha, especially in the modern orthodoxy, which is meta halacha. Meta halacha refers to concepts which are beyond halacha, yet we have to incorporate them into the legal process. Such, for example, how will people feel? How it will impact the world around us, or Jews or non-Jews, etc. And I believe that there is no such thing as a meta halacha. Everything is part of the halacha. Every consideration when we look at a mitzvah, when we talk about monetary law, financial laws, etc., yes, then there are certain limits that we have to follow. But when we talk about the mitzvot sheben adam lakom, between us and God, and our religious practice, we have to remember that God gave us the Torah for the sake of the human race, for us. So we have to consider how it impacts others. So we have to take into consideration everything: emotions, perception, what will happen down the road, what will happen to this community or to the other community. So that sets the tone when we approach the question. A famous case is something I've discussed before. Rabbi Yosef Misas, when he discusses the question of hair covering for women, his point of departure is that he looks around him and he says, most Orthodox women in my community do not cover their head. Am I going to say that they're sinners, or am I going to say that I misunderstood the halakha? I have to find a solution. In his case, it was a case of shalom bayit, a fight between a husband and wife. And he said, my objective is to bring peace to this family. So this is something that we have to have in mind. Also, we have to ask this question: what are the consequences? What will happen when we issue the psak halakha this way or that way? What will happen? So, what is the question? Is it a question about rituals? For example, do you hold the etrog in your right hand, backhand? Does it face you? Do you say Hoshana on Shabbat, or you don't say Hoshanot on Shabbat? Do you say half a Kaddish, full Kaddish? When do you take off the tefillin? All these things, if you did this or did that, no one was harmed. God understands you. God has I'm sure that the Kadosh Baruch Hu has access to an encyclopedia with all the minhagim of the Jewish people. And if he sees you doing something strange, he says, oh, this guy must be Moroccan or Galician or Polish. It's okay. This is his minhag. That's not a problem. But when the consequences are associated with other things, for example, if we go back to the etrog, does the woman say a bracha on her etrog or not? So were those, even Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who insisted women do not say bracha on an etrog because it depends on time, and this is what the Shulchan Aruch ruled. So they were minimalist. They went with what the Shulchan Aruch says, but what is the impact on women? Do women feel included in the synagogue, or do they feel excluded? That it affects other things. So those are the things that we have to consider. What are the consequences of what could be considered even a trivial halakha? Once we figure this out, and once we know that we have an objective, we have to find a solution, or we are trying to justify a certain phenomenon that will make people's lives comfortable and will not go against halakha, then we can set out to look at the sources that we have. And we go to Tanakh, and then we go systematically to the Mishnah, the Talmud, and then to Maimonides and other sources. It's very common, I see it all the time, that people start with the halachic essays. They start with the Shulchan Aruch, and then they go to the Mishnah Berurah, and then to Rambam. So basically, they are time travelers. They start at the 15th centuries, go to the 19th, go back to the 12th, and then to the first. So time is a dimension, and they could travel in it. But this is not the way that you study halakha. You have to go back to the source. Where did it start? If, for example, we go back to the issue of kisur rosh, head covering for women. If the first time that this is mentioned in our sources is in the 6th or 7th century, then I want to ask, and what was before that? And if it was mentioned at an earlier period, then I say, okay, this is something that has deeper roots. And so we continue as we go to the psak, unfolding those sources. If it seems, for example, that the Babylonian Talmud is very solid on a certain issue, but it doesn't work with the way people observe halakha today, we have to say, wait, maybe there's a source I didn't look, and that's the Yerushalmi Talmud. Let's see how this Talmud understands the sugya. And sometimes you will find a new commentator. So we really have to do a very thorough research, and we don't have to invent the wheel. Like if other people were issued a psak like that, we could rely on it. And God willing, we will combine our energy and forces together to create maybe a database with all the options of halakha that are available. Instead of saying, this is what you must do, we say, this is what you can do. Okay, so this is in the general lines, but we'll talk about it more in detail, and I hope people will bring up questions either online or or later on I'll answer it, and now I can see the chat as it's going on. So let me share the screen. I'll go to the file that I created on Safaria, and you could find it on Safaria when you look for Torah ve'ahava, Smicha Avelut, or you search for my name, you will find it. It's accessible to everyone. And we're still looking at the Mishnaic sources, Mishnah, Talmud, and trying to understand how the concept of Avelut has developed. So this is a Baraita. It's an external Mishnah that is quoted in the Talmud, Moed Katan, 20b, and it refers to, is that, yeah. So it says this. The sages thought, with regard to all the relatives mentioned in the Torah, in the passage referring to Kohanim, for which a Kohen becomes impure, a mourner must mourn for them. We mentioned this last week. So if the Kohen is allowed to become impure in a case of death of one of his immediate relatives, children, siblings, parents, and spouse, and his wife, an unmarried sister. So the Mishnah says the sages added other relatives to this list: his maternal brother and his unmarried sister from the same mother, and his married sister, whether from the same father, from the same mother. Okay, well, we could write the family tree later, like half brothers, half sisters, etc. But this is interesting. וכשם שמתאבל עליהם, כך מתאבל על שניים שלהם דברי רבי עקיבא. So just as one mourns for them, so too he mourns for their relatives who are his second degree relatives. Meaning that if one has to mourn, for example, for his brother, then he will mourn for his brother's wife. He will mourn for his brother's in-laws, which we'll see later that they were accustomed to mourn for them. דברי רבי עקיבא, רבי שמעון בן אלעזר אומר, אינו מתאבל אלא על בן בנו ועל אבי אביו. But Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, the only extension of Avelut is to one's grandson and to one's grandfather, which is also not practiced today. Today, mourning is considered only for the 7 direct relatives. וחכמים אומרים, כל שמתאבל עליו מתאבל עמו. And the rabbis say, any relative over whom one would mourn if that person died, one mourns with him when he is in mourning. So first, it's important to see in the Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar are not of the same generation. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is 2 generations after Rabbi Akiva. He's a later Tana, and he limits the scope of the Avelut that Rabbi Akiva mentions. What we see here is that there is dispute between the rabbis regarding Avelut, meaning that, I'm going one second back to the screen to see everyone. What we see here is that it is not that simple to say that we take the list as it appears in the Torah regarding the impurity of the Kohen and apply it to the Avelut. Those are 2 different issues, and it makes sense, as we explained last week. The prohibition on the Kohanim to become impure stemmed from the need to dissociate people from the practices of Egypt, where the Kohanim were the gatekeepers for the netherworld, and actually they sort of approved your life. Someone could have had a terrible life, could be a terrible person, but if you did all the right arrangements to be buried properly and to contact the right Kohen, everything would work fine. The Torah didn't want that to happen, which is happening today, right? You could live your life any way you want, just get the right rabbi to officiate at your funeral, and it's like yours, God forbid, I'm talking about mine, then everything will be okay. Torah does not want that to happen, so it tells the Kohanim not to become impure. But in terms of Avelut, what would make sense when we speak about Avelut and the obligation to become Avel, the logical thing would be to say there's no obligation. It all a question of how you feel when something happens. So if you feel sad, you mourn. If you don't feel sad, you don't mourn. That is the person on the personal level. On the communal level, there's also something that you have to do for the community. There are community practices. So, and I've seen it more than once where people put on a face for the community, sitting shiva for their relatives, when behind the scenes there were so many fights. There were so many disagreements. They didn't want to sit shiva. They were fighting over the will. They didn't like the parents. They did not talk to each other. So, in some cases, they would put that face for the community. So, and we see this reflected in that text. Going back to that text, the rabbis, that this is sort of the we could call it the formative period of halacha, and we'll see it. We'll see it when we discuss other issues of halacha. The rabbis of the Mishnah very frequently would try to solidify the laws and create a uniform halacha that would apply to everyone. They encountered in many cases from the time of the Second Temple a system that was more flexible. And I think you could figure out, it's not how we were taught in the yeshiva, I know, but when we look at the Tanakh and the Torah, and search for the meticulous definitions of every law. When do you start eating? When do you finish eating? How much do you eat? How do you eat it? When do you pray? How many times you wrap the tefillin around your arm? All these things are not mentioned. You may say they are Torah shebe'al peh. Some of them are, some of them are not. But in general, the role of the rabbis in rabbinic period, what they decided to do was to create a uniform system for all. And I know it sounds strange, but if you know about the Torah reading cycle, this is the best example of a halacha that survived in a more fluid way for much longer than all the rest. For almost until the 10th century, there were still people who would finish the Torah in 3.5 years, and each community would finish at a different time. Eventually, the uniform halacha won over, and everybody on the same page reads the same parasha every Shabbat. But with many other halachot, the period of uniformity came earlier. Such as in this case, what happens here is that up until Rabbi Akiva, the laws of Avelut are fluid. People mourn their relatives, and they mourn the relatives that they feel connected to. And I recommend a book for those of you who read Hebrew. I think I put it in the syllabus. There's this book called Ketz Haim by Professor Nisan Rubin of Bar Ilan University. I don't know if it's a relative of Rabbi Yamin who's with us tonight. So Nisan Rubin has the two books. One is called Ketz Haim, and that one is which is about Avelut. Another one about joyous life cycles. Very interesting. And when talking about the cycles of Avelut, the way he explains the reason for those larger cycles is the structure of the family. Is that up until the Mishnaic period, people lived in agrarian societies, and a woman who got married usually would move with her husband into the husband's family. So not only you had the nucleus family, you had the extended family, and the way they say it takes a village to raise a child. That was really the way people lived. So everybody was connected. We know that in some societies, when a child is born, that child becomes the child of the whole tribe. And usually among tribes of hunters-gatherers. And that is done both to protect the child, but also to lessen the the intensity of mourning, because if the child belongs to everyone, there's less connection with each and every one from the tribe. It makes it easier for societies are on the move, and people are hurt. But when we go back to the Baraita here, כשם שמתאבל עליהם, כך מתאבל על שניים שלהם, דברי רבי עקיבא. So Rabbi Akiva extends the Avelut to the relatives of your relative. Whoever one has to mourn for, his children, siblings, and parents, and spouse, their relatives are also part of the equation. Rabbi Shimon says, no, we want to limit that only to the direct line, upwards and downwards, the grandson and the grandfather. The rabbi says, Kol shemit'abel alav mit'abel imo. If you mourn for the person, you mourn with the person. The Gemara asks the questions, Hachamim hainu tanakama. The statements of the rabbi is identical to the statements of the first Tanna, Rabbi Akiva, because they read it as Shniyim shelaim are those that he mourns for. So and the rabbi said, if you mourn for him, you mourn with him. The answer of the Talmud is this: Ika benayu imo babait. So the practical difference of that dispute is whether that person is in the house or not. וכן אמר לרבונה לרבה ברי, באפה נהוג אבלותה, בלה אפה לה תנהוג אבלותה. And that Ravuna told Rabba, he told his son, that the translation here is not, Ravuna told his son Rabba, whose wife was in mourning, you only have to practice mourning in her presence. But when you're not in her presence, you don't have to practice mourning. So that's the explanation of the Talmud. I think there's another way to understand what Hachamim said. In any way, it doesn't have today any practical application, which is when the rabbi says Kol shemit'abel alav mit'abel imo, they mean they're not defining who are the people that one is mourning for. They say if one's relative is in mourning, and if, let's say, one of my relatives is in mourning, and I would have mourned for that relative if something happened to him, then I have to mourn with him as well. It doesn't matter who is he mourning for. And that to me makes more sense. Let's say that person is mourning for his master, for his rabbi, for his teacher, for his good friend. That was also the practice to mourn for. Then I mourn with him. So it's a question of empathy, and that is how the Mishnah has to be understood. And then we go to Talmud Yerushalmi in the same tractate. That's where most of the halachot are mentioned. And here, no English, so I'll translate. So the Talmud says this. It's a baraita that's mentioned there. Hare shemet hamiv o hamoto o ehad mikrovei ishto eno kofa lo lichol v'lo lifkos ela noeg ima kedech shi noeget. Assuming that, or in a case that one's father-in-law or mother-in-law or one of the relatives of his wife passed away, he cannot impose on her, cannot force her to put on makeup for him. You cannot tell her, I'm not in mourning, so you are my wife and you belong to me. We're talking about that within this social context. But rather he should behave like her, meaning not only he cannot demand that his wife will put on makeup or will dress in a certain way, but he himself has to be in mourning, not only for his father-in-law or his mother-in-law, but also for one of her relatives. And in many languages, in many societies, the in-laws are called parents. Right? I think, if I'm not wrong, then in America most people would call their in-laws, right, dad and mom. Am I right? This is the norm. But the question, do they feel like that? In Arabic, it's not just that you choose to call dad and mom, but the name for the father-in-law is ammo, which means my uncle or my. So you consider them a relative. So that that is something that's mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi. And also for her, if her father-in-law or mother-in-law or one of his relatives died, she cannot put makeup and mourn with him as he does. Shemuel Amar, Lo shanu ela hamiv o hamoto, ha'echad mikol hakrovim lo. So Shmuel, who is not a Tana, is not a Tanaitic source, but rather the first generation of the rabbis of the Talmud, disagrees. And here is another concept that we have to have in mind when we look at the Talmud, to look at the names there. Who says what? So the Baraita that we quoted is a Mishnaic source. Shmuel is a Talmudist rabbi, is one of the Amoraim, the first generation, so he's later to that. So when he says it's different, that is because he lives in a different period and in a different location. He lives in Babylonia, and this was written in Eretz Israel. He disagrees with that because the social norms have changed. And that is actually something that applies to a rule that we find in the Talmud. There's a famous rule in the Talmud that says, Halacha kerav be'isurei v'chishmuel b'mamuna. Whatever has to do with prohibitions of kashrut or other things, and there is a dispute between those two Amoraim, those two rabbis, Rav and Shmuel. If it's a matter of prohibition, we follow the opinion of Rav. If it's a matter of monetary dispute, we follow the opinion of Shemuel. And why is that? Because Rav migrated to Babylonia from Eretz Israel. So, and Shemuel was a local. Shemuel was a native of Babylonia. So when they had a dispute over issues of prohibitions, isur ve'eter, kashrut, mixtures of meat and dairy, etc., or relationships, etc., Rav was considered the carrier of the halacha as coming from Israel. But when it came to monetary laws, Shmuel, who was a native of Babylonia, knew the local regulations better than the Rav, and on that he was an authority. So here we're talking about minhagim, customs, and not Isurei Torah. It's not biblical principles, and we follow Shmuel on that. He has a different opinion, but even his opinion is not one that we follow today. Lo shanu ela hamiv o hamoto, ha'echad mikol hakrovim lo. So that only applies to the father-in-law or the father or the mother-in-law, but not to other relatives. And now we move to the next 2 generations later. We find Mar Ukva. And as I said before, always look, since we have to study halacha chronologically, always look at the names. If you're not sure when those rabbis have lived, Google them. So it's interesting. Most of the rabbis that are mentioned in the Talmud, you could find it now in Wikipedia. You want to know when did they live? Copy the name or type into Wikipedia Mar Ukva, and it will tell you. But we know Mar Ukva was of the 4th generation, if I recall correctly, later than Shmuel. Shachiv lebar Hamua, savar lemitav alav aleh shiva u'shloshim. So the brother-in-law of Mar Ukva passed away, and he wanted to sit for him Shiva and to do the 7 and 30-day period of mourning. Ravuna went into his house. This is in the Talmud Bavli. Ravuna went into his house, found him observing the rites of mourning, and said to him, "Do you desire to eat mourners' food?" It's called Sudanyata. There they had a special food that they served to the Avelim. Most probably it was something like majadra, the dish of rice and lentils. I know that because in my household, they didn't serve it to the mourners, but God forbid if someone would serve it on Shabbat. It's in some communities they serve it on Shabbat. My mother would not let anyone eat it on Shabbat. She said it's mourners' food, so probably it's this. But Rav Huna rebuked Mar Ukva. He said, "Oh, you want to eat the food? It's really sort of disparaging to say something like that. You only practice the Avelut because you want to eat the food." But we see that by the time of Mar Ukva, already that practice of mourning for the in-laws has disappeared. And then they bring the Baraita. I'll skip that. Okay, so And that was just a brief survey of some halachot that are mentioned in the Talmud. We have a very good source that covers most of the summarizes many of the halachot that are covered or mentioned in the Talmud. And I see that people commented that yet in many different places people call their in-laws mother and father, whether it's in Uganda or China and other places. So yes, this is a common practice. So the source that I'm talking about is known as Masechet Smachot. And why is it called Masechet Smachot, the tractate of joy? Because it speaks about mourning, and nobody wants to say that he's learning the laws of mourning. So I'm learning the laws of Samachot, of Simchas, of happiness and joy. Now, a word of caution regarding Masechtot Ktanot. Masechtot Ktanot, in Sefaria, you will find them under Tannaitic sources. They're not part of the Mishnah or the Talmud. Where do you find them in the Talmud? In the most printed editions, the Masechtot Ktanot appear at the end of the whole Talmud, at the end of Masechet Nida. And they deal with Avelut, with the laws of scribes, with the laws of Kala, Nida, etc. So Sefaria listed them under Tannaitic sources, but they're not Tannaitic sources. There was a debate regarding the origin of the minor tractates for many centuries, and it has been determined in the last 100, 200 years that all these minor tractates were written at the time of the Geonim or later. So what it is, it's a compilation of halachot that some are mentioned in the Talmud, some are not. They're anonymous. They're written in the style of the Mishnah, but they don't have the same authority, same binding authority of the Mishnah. And part of the reason that is misleading because the names that are mentioned, since the author compiled halachic sources, Mishnaic sources, he uses the names that are mentioned in the Mishnah. But this is a good review of what is written in the Talmud. I'm not going to read all of it, but just the some salient halachot that are important. And then I believe the next thing we will do, we are going to start with the Shulchan Aruch, and with that we'll review the development of halacha and the practical halachot. And I remind everybody again that there are books out there that summarizes the laws of Avelut in English, in Hebrew, in Spanish, and in French, I'm sure, in many other languages. But we're looking at the development of halacha and for us to understand how to rule in associated issues. So the chapter 6, halacha aleph, in Masechet Smachot says this: אבל אסור לקרות בתורה ובנביאים ובכתובים, ואסור לשנות במשנה ובתלמוד, בהלכות ובאגדות. A mourner is not allowed to read Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, scriptures, cannot study Mishnah, Talmud, halachot, and midrashic material. It doesn't say when, for which period. We assume that it refers to the 7 days, and is also forbidden birchitza, besicha, ni'ilat sandal v'tashmish hamita. Is not allowed to wash. Is not allowed to anoint himself, to wear sandals, or to have sexual relationships. V'chayav b'chisui harosh u'v'chfiat hamita, and he must cover his head and turn over the bed. So let's speak briefly about these things and how they evolved until today. The rechitza is something that many people are familiar with, and it has become a major problem today. And we have to have in mind that we have to remember that our practices today, I think I mentioned last week maybe, are not as they were before. People used to wash once a week. Now we do it every day, even more than once a day. So the main thing is to show to yourself and to others a lessening of the level of luxury and comfort that you have. So to each his own. You don't have to suffer, but you don't also have to to live in luxury. But if one should take a daily shower and change also the undergarments, even though we'll see later that Hag is evolved not to change at all, but that also comes from a period where people had less clothes. They didn't change regularly. Ni'ilata sandal, wearing sandals. So it's leather shoes like on Yom Kippur. Again, Sidon life. The reality back then was that either you had shoes or sandals or you didn't. Shoes were considered a luxury. How do we know that shoes are a luxury? Because we know when we say the brachot in the morning, Birkot HaShahar, there's one bracha that says She'asa li kol tzorki. Thank God who provided me with everything I need. And if you look at the Masechet Brachot, I think it's page 63 in Masechet Brachot, you'll see the process that the Gemara goes through in compiling all Birkot HaShahar. Why? So they gather brachot from different communities and put them together, and then they see this bracha She'asa li kol tzorki and say, where do we put it? Technically, theoretically, you could have said She'asa li kol tzorki, thank God who provided me with everything I need, and you're covered. That's it. It covers all the things that you want to praise God for in the morning. So then they assigned it to wearing shoes. Why? Because now this is the cherry on top. Not only God not only gave me food and clothes and the ability to walk straight and all those beautiful things, I even have shoes. That was an item of luxury, and it sounds so strange today. You could go in America to Payless shoe stores and get shoes for $10, right? But still, think of shoes as a status symbol, right? Even with the shoes that you could get for $10, people would want to go for designer shoes, for something that shows their. So shoes were in back in the time were a luxurious item, and they have remained such in many ways. So when we say that one should not wear sandals, strictly speaking, it's not wearing leather. But if we understand conceptually, is changing your level of comfort. And that's different from Yom Kippur, which is a different story. Tashmish Amita is conjugal relationships. This Hayav, before that, Sicha or anointing is not something that we do today. It doesn't speak about the ointments that we usually apply, creams, whether it's Vaseline or facial or whatever it is that we use for hygienic or cosmetic reason or anything like that. Sicha back in the day was the application of fragrant oils that in many cases replaced washing. And again, this is a level of luxury that one has to consider what he does or does not. Hayav bechisui harosh. He must cover his head. So most people did not cover their head, but for the Avel, what the text says, he has to do kisui harosh, which was either putting a hood on, or in the source that I put in the first file, but we didn't have time to go through, is wrapping his face. That's called atifa. And in many cases, the Avel would wrap his robe around his face, covering his mouth, his or her mouth, and that was a symbolic act showing that he cannot talk. There's nothing to say. Kfiyat amita, what we have as a remnant of Kfiyat amita, turning over the bed, is sitting on a lower, on a low chair. And that is also a source of discussions, like how high, how low. Again, we'll get to the halachot, but the idea is level of comfort. Instead of sitting comfortably, you sit at a lower place. So back in the day, the bed that they're talking about is basically a wooden frame with ropes tied. There were holes in the wooden frame, and they would tie ropes in between like a net, and then they would throw on it a hide or some pillows that they had. So basically, they were IKEA. This is when IKEA was was invented. It was a simple bed, just a wooden frame. It just didn't have like this kind of crazy Swedish name, but you could just call it a bed. Not Oscar Grufen or something, but the idea of kfiat hamita was matir et havalim. You would untie the ropes from the wooden frame, and they would sit on the floor with the mattress. But have in mind also, and again, as we go through the halachot, that people used to sit on the floor or on the ground most day. And so it was either you sit on a very low place or you sit on the ground, but people didn't have chairs. For us, it's very difficult to sit on lower chairs. And it's actually not a good thing, because when people used to do that, they had a good practice. Just think of, if you sit up and down 10, 15 times a day, then you get your burpees and your squats or whatever you want to do for exercise. It's a true thing. Sociologists speak about that. So, okay, we'll go back to the text. They speak about Rabban Gamliel and his practices. Halacha Gimel says, Bayom HaRishon eno noten tefillin, Basheni noten tefillin, Bashlishi ba'u achirim lehnachamo, Cholzan kedivrei Rabbi Eliezer. So on the first day, one does not wear tefillin. On the second day, he wears tefillin. On the third day, when people come to visit him, he takes them off, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yoshua says on the first and the second day he does not wear tefillin. On the third day he wears tefillin, but if people came to comfort him, he has to take them off. So we see practices that we don't have today. Most people today would wear tefillin after the burial, even on the first day. It's because they feel that urge, that obsession of not missing a day with tefillin. So even though the halakha tells them you're allowed to or you're not obligated to wear tefillin today, they would want to do that. But that was not the practice back then. There was a debate whether one should put wear tefillin on the second day. Now it's not clear from this specific text, but we know from other sources that people would not visit on the first or second day, and would let the Avelim sit quietly. And that's also something that has changed. Or at least the immediate family would come, and that is something that has changed dramatically. Even I think from the time that I was a teenager in Yerushalayim, maybe it has to do with society also. People are much more talkative at the shiva. Like everybody feels that they have an obligation to sit with the mourners and distract them. And that is a mistake. And first of all, I mean, I don't like to put labels, and I understand why people do that. They feel uncomfortable. They want to sort of clear the air. But the purpose of the shiva obviously is not for small talk. It's not to talk about trivial issues and distract the mourner. It is meant to give the mourners an opportunity to speak, to express their emotions, to talk about, if they want, to talk about the deceased, to talk about what he or she meant for them, and to be there to listen to them. And also a situation when this becomes a social gathering of the visitors, when the mourners are sitting aside and other people are mulling about and talking to each other, this is not exactly what has to be done. Another halakha that's interesting here, הלכה ה' בא אצל קרוביו ממקום אחר, בשני ובשלישי משלים עמהן, ברביעי ובחמישי מונה לעצמו. If one came from out of town, and his relatives are already sitting shiva, בשני ובשלישי משלים עמהן. If he came on the second and the third day, he just keeps counting with them. But if he came on the fourth or fifth day of the shiva, he has to start from the beginning. According to one opinion. According to another opinion, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, if he came and they're sitting shiva, even on the seventh day, that is his seventh day, and if they are not there, even on the second day, he counts for himself. I'll stop share for a second to see the chat. Okay, so Okay, so in the back shoe, we're still talking about shoes. That's an important thing. But we'll get more into details when we continue. But the interesting thing about this baraita or halacha is that it basically says that one does not have to sit the whole shiva. It's not a personal thing. Rather, it's the obligation of the family. What does the family do together? So if his relatives were sitting, then it's okay, it counts for him. Later on, we'll see that there is a concept called shemu'ah rehuka, a belated knowledge or belated news, meaning that one heard after about the passing away only after the Shiva or Shloshim already passed, so that changes his level of Avelut. But then again, this is trying to create rules for emotions. The rule should be there that however one feels, that is how he should practice his Avelut. But have in mind, when we speak about Avelut, it's also something that pulls the community in. The community has to come, so the community has the right to say, if you want to mourn and sit by yourself, fine, but we don't have to come because technically you're not obligated. Okay. Here we go to Perek Tet, Halacha Aleph, the 9th chapter, Halacha Aleph, and it says this: Al kol hametim kulan eino korea, ela al rabo shelimdo chokhmah. One does not tear his clothes for anyone else except for his master, who taught him wisdom. So obviously, it doesn't talk about the relatives; it speaks about other metim, other people who passed away, and from the fact that the halacha had to mention that, we understand that people used to do that. People used to tear their clothes over over not just relatives but over other people as well. Now the obvious question would be asked: okay, if they tear so many clothes, right? How do they survive? I mean, we just said that they didn't have many clothes. They had to wash once a week for Shabbat. So we'll see that unlike we'll go. Yeah, it's an halacha het. I'll go back to halacha aleph later. Al kol hametin kulan sholel leachar shiv'a leachar shloshim. Al aviv v'al imo sholel leachar shloshim v'no me'achel le'olam. So, it says for all other people, for all other relatives, I think the word is missing here. Leachar shiv'a leachar shloshim should be me'acheh. That one could do a temporary stitch after the Shiva, and after the Shloshim, he could do a permanent. He could sew it in a permanent way. Al aviv al imo sholel leachar shloshim, but for his father and mother, he could only do a temporary, or not called a temporary, an amateur stitch after 30 days, and he can never completely fix it. So what we see is that people used to tear their clothes, but then they would fix it. They would mend them. What do people do today with the garments that they tore during the Avelut? They throw them away. And most people throw them away. I know few people who felt that they wanted to keep that as a memento, but most people that I know just throw them away. And of course, this is because of the price or how cheap it is to get clothes today. Halacha bet. I'll try to review just briefly everything that we have here today, so we could continue to Shulchan Aruch next week. Hakol holtzin al hacham ve'al talmid. In the previous halacha, also something important. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is the same Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that we saw previously disputing the obligation to mourn for certain relatives and not others. He says, Hacham shemet kol she'omdin alav b'sha'at mitato korein alav. He says, even for a rabbi, for a scholar, it doesn't depend on whether you were his student or not, but rather whether you were there when he passed away. So we see the trend again of trying to limit the cycle of Avelut, and that could stem from the fact that society became more fragmented, more separated, and then maybe it could explain the reason that in America many people I just see that someone commented here that people use a ribbon sewn to the garment and tear that. It's not about Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. It's more. I've seen it in the non-Orthodox communities, but also in the Orthodox community that I served, and people were less observant. I just heard an interesting term from someone to address that. This is sort of like the Sephardic traditional communities that cannot fall under the categories of conservative, reform, etc. He says it's a driving community. So I like this definition. It's a community that wants an Orthodox rabbi, theoretically Orthodox practices, but people drive to shul. So it's a driving community. So in the driving communities, I had it more than once where people, when we got to the Kriyah, people would say, "Oh, I want to tear my clothes. Maybe I'll go with the ribbon." And when I lived in LA, the cantor that worked with me was an Iraqi Jew born in India. He was a very traditional person. And he says, "No, you must do Kriyah, you must do Kriyah." And I would tell him, "Listen, if they don't want to do it, there's no point in enforcing them. This is the norm. They could do it." And I'm telling you also, if as a rabbi, someone says, "I do not want to do Kriyah, this is what I want to do," let them do the ribbon. Because our way of expressing Avelut has changed. If later or maybe before the burial, you have a chance to sit with people and explain to them why it is done, and give them an option. You don't say you must do that, but rather you explain that tearing the clothes shows that there is that something that is torn within us. We sort of almost we expose our heart to show that we are wounded. Do you want to do it? If they say yes, fine. And if they say no, we'll do the ribbon. Okay, do the ribbon. Just like I said in the beginning, no one was harmed. No harm was done. Whether a ribbon was torn or a garment, there's no victim, so to speak, right? So that's where we practice flexibility in halakha, and we rely on the rule halakha kedivra mekel ba'avel. You always go with the more lenient opinion, meaning the more accommodating opinion to the avel. So in halakha bed we read this: Hakol holtzin al hacham ve'al talmid. You have to be holetz. Now, what is holetz? It's not in modern Hebrew lahlotz. Usually lahlotz et hana'al, to take off your shoes, but here it means to bare your shoulder. People would pull the robe to the side, and there were rules. Hacham shemet holtzim lefanav et hayamin. If the person who passed away, if the deceased was a scholar, then the right shoulder is revealed, is exposed. Av bedin shemet holtzim lefanav et hasmol. And if it's the head of the Sanhedrin, you expose your left shoulder, because that's where your heart is, just as with the tearing for parents versus other relatives. Nasi shemet holtzim lefanav et shtei yadayim. But when the president of the Sanhedrin, like the head of the whole religious establishment, passes away, both hands should be exposed, that to show complete and total mourning. And the Mishnah or the Halakha tells her here about Rabbi when Rabbi Eliezer dies, that Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, Halatz Rabbi Akiva lefanav et shtei yadav. Rabbi Akiva exposed both hands. Vaya makeh al libo vehadam shotet. And he hit his chest where the heart is, and he was bleeding. And he said, Ribi, Ribi, my master, Rechev Yisrael ufarashav, you are the chariot of Am Yisrael, you are the horseman. Harbe ma'ot yesh li ve'en shulchani le'artzotam. I have a lot of little coins, and I need a banker who will a money changer who will change it. This is a metaphor for someone who could help him with halachot. Interesting is this phrase, Hayam makeh libo ve'adam shotet. This seems to be in direct contradiction to a biblical prohibition that says lo tidgodedu, that one is not allowed to wound himself as a sign of mourning for the dead. So did Rabbi Akiva really did it? Is it an exaggeration of the text? We don't know if he did it. How did he reconcile it with the biblical prohibition? He would have said that the lo tidgodedu of the Torah has to do with paganism. It's a pagan ritual, but he did it out of being, in that emotional state of mind. But that would bring question about other halachot that I mentioned in the same phrase with lo tidgodedu, such as tattoo and other things that could stem from paganism. Then they speak about now interesting halacha gimel, al kol hamitim kulam eno choletz, al aviv ve'al imo choletz. One does this bearing of the shoulder for all, only for the father and mother, but not for other people who passed away. Ve'af al aviv ve'al imo im eno rotze lachlotz lo yachlotz, and he should not do it even if for father and mother if he doesn't want to do so. And Rabbi Akiva chose not to do it for his father, so he showed such respect for Rabbi Eliezer, but not for his father. So, not that he was disrespectful to his father, maybe he wanted to show that this is not something, he shows really the disparity between his spiritual father and physical father. Possible, not certain, that there is a tradition that appears only in late sources about Rabbi Akiva being Ben Gerim, that he's a descendant of converts, and it could be that Rabbi Akiva considered maybe he was born before his father was converted, and then he decided that he's not related to him, so he didn't have to do the same Avelut. I'm not sure that this is the case. Then there are other differences here that are mentioned between how one mourns for his parents and for others. I'll cover them briefly because I want really to continue next week to the Shulchan Aruch. This is more a survey of the biblical Mishnaic and post-Mishnaic literature before we go into the realm of halacha. If you have time to go and look at the minor tractates and read those things, I also did a series on Spreaker on Masechet Semachot more in depth. But I think that it's listed under Sephardic luminaries because I consider the Geonim to be the first of the Sephardic tradition. So then they speak about other practices that people had and the difference between other people who passed away and father and mother. So one thing that was practiced, korea besakin, the kira was done with the knife. Today, only the first cut is done with the knife, and that's to enable to the avel to tear the clothes, and it's done with hands for everyone. They used to expose the heart, the chest. Then they speak about how long, how big it should be. Shalosh etzbaot. Then it says that for other people, one only tears the upper garment, but for his father and mother, even if he's wearing 100 layers, it's an exaggeration, let's say 2-3 layers, he has to tear all of them. A woman only tears the upper part, the upper garment, but Rabbi Yehuda seems to be more strict, or I don't know how would we call that. He says she has to tear the undergarment and turn it back, and then she tears the upper garments. And we'll talk about those practices of what women do. Some do it at the cemetery, some do it at home. When we get to halacha, halacha het is about what we mentioned before, mending the garment immediately or after shloshim. They spoke about begadim megoatzim in halacha yud, which people translate as ironed garment, but this is not the they didn't refer to that. They didn't iron clothes at the time. This speaks about bleaching, and again, something that we'll talk when we get to the halachot. Halacha Yud Bet is interesting. Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, 11 and 12. It says this: Al kol hametim kulan asur betisporet ad le'achar 30 yom. For all relatives who passed away, one cannot take a haircut until 30 days have passed. And this is not what people today. Most people today shave or take a haircut after 7 days after the shiva. Alavi v'alimo ad sheishalach pera. But for his father and mother, until it grows wild, and his fathers and his friends will rebuke him. So originally it was a social thing. It was about the society, your friends coming and telling you, okay, enough. You have more than enough. Now it's time to come back to society. So this has preserved in a way until today that people come to the synagogue and they wait for the rabbi to tell them, although this is not really necessary because our norms have changed again. We take haircuts more frequently, we shave more frequently, and in certain types of work where people are, the procession is extremely important. So one does not have to wait to be reminded by his friends. It's a question of respect that he shows for his parents. But that is another detail that has changed. We'll read more, I think, a little bit of this next time. But one more thing, asur lelech lebet hamishte, mishte shel mitzvah. We'll talk about it next time. I would like you to, if you have any questions or instances that where you had a sort of a conflict with that, and that is going to a wedding, going to a joyous occasion, and some people even sometimes they have a question whether they could go out with friends to a concert, to a restaurant. Is any outing forbidden? This is an important question, and we'll look at it next week, God willing. So that is for today. Thank you all for joining. Baruch Hashem, we had today at one point over 30 people. It's good to have everybody. We feel like it's we're present in one place. We almost can have a minyan, to fill out together. So Bezrat Hashem, we'll see you all next week.